Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Debatable Discussions podcast. Today we're incredibly lucky to have Matt Sinclair with us. Matt, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And so for our listeners who don't know, Matt is one of the most active Conservative Party campaigners in the country. And he recently stood in, am I right in saying, the council by-election in the borough of Hammersmith and Fulham?
Correct, in the Lily ward, where I came a close second, but increased the Conservative vote share.
Yeah. So it is an honour to have you on today, and I'm sure you've got some very good insight from, well, I guess, inside the Conservative Party itself.
I'd like to think so, certainly.
So the first question is a bit of a broad one, but in your opinion, how do you think Kemi Baden outperformed as the leader of the Conservative Party in her first sort of nearly a year now?
I think it's important to state that she has an incredibly tough job. There hasn't been Conservative leader of the opposition for 15, 16 years now. And she's certainly taking it over in a new role at a time where really the country has had enough of it. And if you look back in history, your first kind of leaders of the opposition, when a party's been removed from government, tend to be up against it. No one wants to listen to them. Getting any cut through is very difficult. People have had enough with them. And internally within the party, there's always a lot of divisions. This is the reason things went wrong. That's the reason things went wrong. So I think she's got, I would start by saying, an incredibly difficult job. I don't think anyone denies that. What I would say is I felt at the beginning, the first 2 or 3 months, he was clearly settling into the job. Prime Minister's questions, which is the leader of the opposition's real weekly opportunity to get cut through. That was, I would say, not the best start for her. I think she was weak at times. I think she went in on the wrong political debates and tried to press Starmer on areas where he was relatively strong. However, I think she's really grown into the role, particularly over the last 6 weeks to 2 months. And I feel she's really strengthened in that time. So I would say it's gone well. People don't want to hear from the Conservatives at the moment. They kicked us out of office just over a year ago. Quite frankly, I think Kemi's doing an awful lot of work inside the party in terms of reforming CCHQ, building a policy platform. So has it been a perfect year? No. There's definitely a lot of work on areas, but I think there's a lot of positives to take as well.
Well, that's quite interesting there, because I think one does have to recognise, as you said, that she has had a very difficult time so far. But something that I think me and Dejan have noticed is that perhaps the Tory MP who most dominates, say, social media is becoming Robert Jenrick. Now, do you think he's going to sort of try and position himself to become the next leader? Is there some support for him to become the next leader? And importantly, do you think he would do a better job than Kemi?
Oh, that is a tough question to ask a Conservative. I think that Rob is doing an absolutely fantastic job. He's really leaning into the digital campaigning side. I think everyone's seen his videos on fare dodging on TFL and some other sort of digital stuff that he's done. And that's very much within his brief as Shadow Justice Secretary. So I think he's definitely got a very high profile. I think the shadow cabinet member's job to try and get cut. I don't think that because he's doing a fantastic job at doing that and really promoting his brief necessarily means that that's a bad thing for Kemi or a threat to her in some way. She's got a very different role from what Rob has to do. Rob has to focus on his brief and get cut through and engage actively with members in the wider public. And I think he's doing an exemplary job of that. And I would love to see more of the shadow cabinet kind of follow his energy. Does he want to be leader of the Conservative Party one day? I've absolutely no doubt. I think it's every politician's ambition to try and climb the ladder. What is it Boris once said? Crazed wasps in a jam jar. They all want to get there, get out, get to the top, break free. So it's perfectly natural that he should want to do it. But I think for the time being, he is providing great cut through to Kemi, where maybe she's struggling slightly on that front. And Rob's doing a great job there, but she's doing so much inside the party that Rob simply can't do because he's not that leader of the opposition. So I actually think they're working well as a team. And with the recent re-promotion, if you like, of James Cleverley to the front benches, I think that shows that Kemi isn't threatened by having these big names around her. She wants them. She wants the strongest possible team that she can have to hold Labour to account. So I think it's a good thing that Rob is doing what he's doing. I think it's really helpful for the party, and I don't see it as wildly threatening to Kemi by any means. Although I do know that listening to external, perhaps less partisan commentary, that is not how it comes across.
Online have been disappointed maybe the return of some of the sort of old guard, if you can say so, of the Conservatives. What's your take on that? Do you think it helps the party, or do you think it hurts the party to sort of bring back some associations from the...
I think, people like James Cleverley, Robert Jenrick, if we were to put him in that same bucket, I don't think that hurts us. And take Cleverley as an example. He was very clear in his conference speech last October. He said, we've got to apologise. We made mistakes. He stood on that stage and he said that. So I think he's being very honest and he's happy to listen. As we say, Kemi's doing a lot of work on this sort of new policy forum to really refigure out what the Conservative Party is, to understand what we want to be. And they're fully behind that. So I don't feel that bringing back these old names is an issue. If, for example, you wanted to bring back your Boris Johnsons or your Liz Trusses, then I think that would be more of an issue. But these individuals, they had a good record in office, particularly James Cleverley. I mean, he was revered across both the Foreign Office and the Home Office as being a genuinely effective leader of those departments. And I think we want the best people with that experience. Not all of them. We've got some amazing shadow cabinet members that people haven't heard of. So, no, I think it's a good thing that we have people like that.
And yeah, I do agree with you there, because I think one can easily say the Tories at the moment are in a fairly sort of deflated state. And when you've got people such promise and who have shown that in the past, like Cleverley, it really does, Kemi should be including them in her shadow cabinet. Another thing you mentioned there, Matt, was policies. And this is what Kemi has come under a bit of fire for, because we see Reform UK has, well, I guess supposedly some quite strong policies. They're very strongly against immigration. However, Kemi's not really offered anything yet. She's not really brought anything or any sort of hard policies which can attract voters. Do you think this has harmed the party? When do you think she'll do this? Because, I mean, personally, I do think it's slightly limiting her.
No, so I understand that argument and that point around we don't have any policies, which I think is both wrong and I disagree with in any case. I think we need to strip back. We were in power for 14 years, but within that, you had various incarnations of the Conservative Party, and it's something we can perhaps touch on later about sort of what is conservatism, because I think we've seen it take 3 or 4 different over the last 14 years. We got booted out of office a year ago. People want us to go away and have a period of reflection, say what we did wrong. If we came back within 6 months and said, here's our new policy platform, vote for us, people wouldn't give us the time of day. We wouldn't have put any real thought into it. We wouldn't have really properly thought through the nuances of what those policy impacts might be. There is, as I say, so much work going on in the background in the Conservative Policy Forum around developing these policies, and we are very, very close to having really solid. And to say that Kemi's come out with nothing, she came out with I think it was her 6 points immigration plan, which I think was really, really solid, really a really good, well thought through policy with genuine real world impact should it be followed through by either this government or the next. So to say she's come out with nothing, I think is wrong. And to say that her not coming out with anything or not coming out with much is hampering her. If she did come out with sort of half-baked policy ideas that were ripped apart, she'd be gone by now. It would be silly politics. It would be performative. It wouldn't be serious. And that's what people want from us again. They want serious opposition with serious ideas. So I think it's perfectly right that we've taken 12 months, 12 to 18 months, 2 years even, to come up with a really solid policy platform that we can deliver to the country and say we are a genuine, credible, different Conservative party, and offer them something to vote for at the polls, not just against, because that's what Labour did at last year's general. They didn't really have any idea of who they were, but they said, we're the grown up, we're going to be the sensible ones back in the room. So don't vote for the Conservatives because they're a mess, just vote for us. But they had no vision, they had no real policies. That's why they've had such a terrible first year in office. So we want to give people something really positive, something really well thought through to vote for, but you can't rush into that.
Yeah, and I guess something to believe in as well is the real aim.
Exactly, a vision. You know, how are we going to make Britain an even better place to live? How are we going to solve the many, many problems we face? What's our role in this pretty unstable world? And these are questions that I don't think anyone's been able to answer at the moment, but we need to figure out for ourselves what the answer to those is. And they're big questions, and we shouldn't rush into those.
You've mentioned that Starmer has had quite a dismal year in office, but do you think this helps the Tories more? Do you think this is actually a sort of hidden opportunity for the more extreme parties such as Reform UK, but Nigel Farage and Jeremy Corbyn's new party?
Yeah, so I think firstly, I would say clearly this is an opportunity for reform. I think they've led over 80 consecutive independent opinion polls. So to deny that would be silly, right? They're clearly riding high in the opinion polls at the moment. They had a successful local elections in May, and it'll be interesting to see how they get on next May. Starmer's first year in office, though, as I touched on it, I think it's been such a struggle and such a mess because when they went into the general election and their entire sort of election plan leading up to that was we're not the Conservatives, let's get the adults back in the room. All of a sudden, if we have sensible people making sensible decisions, then everything will be fine. They didn't really have much of a thought through policy platform. I mean, Great British Energy, sort of fine but wildly costly, silly at a time where even Tony Blair's coming out against this idea of net zero. You kind of think, well, that not really thought through. No real idea of where they wanted to stand on the international stage. Starmer did such a job trying to tackle the sort of anti-Semitic Corbynista side of the party as he came in and sort of cleanse out the Labour Party brand that he didn't have much of a vision of where he stood on foreign policy. Although I think that bizarrely Ukraine has been one of his strengths. So they had no real policies. Then they got into government and they started having to make tough decisions. So they said winter fuel, we're going to cut that because, countries bust, as they would say, there's this 27 or whatever it was, 33 or 500 million pound, billion pound black hole, who knows? So they went, winter fuel, we're going to cut that. And then that got a lot of backlash back. And all of a sudden, this governing thing's a little bit difficult. Well, I tell you what, Rachel Reeves will sort it out in her October budget. Well, we'll raise employers' national insurance because that's not quite going against what we said in the general election, where we said we wouldn't raise national insurance because what we really meant was we wouldn't raise employee national insurance. So they're sort of skirting around the edges of credulity there. And then all of a sudden, the bond markets don't like that. Oh, well, I think that might downgrade your growth. I tell you what, hiring's going to slow down. People's real-term pay rises will stop. And then all of a sudden, cost of borrowing in January shoots through the roof. And then what's the next thing? We need to find some more money. Well, how about the welfare reform bill? We'll push that through, which is, I believe, an inherently conservative policy, by the way, and something that should have been pushed through. But oh no, the backbench backlash. Here we go again. Governing's difficult, isn't it, Starmer? It's not just a case of having the adults in the room. And he's clearly losing control of his backbenchers who now hold the whip hands over any sort of welfare reform. So I think really it's been what has been missing throughout all of this year, a vision that they never set out in the general election because it was just if you get us back in, we're not the Tories, therefore everything will be fine. Whereas if all decisions tied through and were working towards an end goal or an end vision, then he would have so much more of command over his backbenchers. He would have more of a platform to drive through the changes that he wants, but he doesn't have that. So they're kind of being battered around by the tide of events. And I think that has been the main cause of Starmer's first year in office. And if you want to touch on reform and Corbyn's new party next, we can.
I was going to say, but the phrase I saw, which very sort of accurately sums up what you said there, Matt, is that Keir Starmer has had more flip flops than Bondi Beach. And I think
Yeah.
it's that whole idea of what does the Labour Party and what does Keir Starmer stand for anymore? The welfare reform bill just seemed very conservative to me. I wasn't really totally sure why he was doing it. He's got a party which, as Ian Dale said in our podcast a few months ago, is far too large to manage. You know, he can't even sort of manage and contain his own party. It's
Yeah.
just wholly, it's going to be a tricky situation. And this is an opportunity for Jeremy Corbyn and him and Zara Sultana's new party. How do you think this will perform? Will this harm the Tories? I mean, it will definitely harm Labour.
I don't see it lasting, is my honest opinion. I think that the real sort of slightly amazing thing at the moment with reform is the fact that despite, Rupert Lowe and some other internal issues here and there, Zia Youssef sort of resigning and then coming back, the fact that they have managed to hold that sort of right wing, if you like, originally splinter party together is quite impressive in itself, because normally these things find a way of imploding. And I would say that is especially true of the left. So I think Corbyn is such a volatile character. I think the sort of left of the Labour Party are so split over issues of Gaza, of welfare back at home, of tax, that actually there's no way that party will hold itself together. I don't think Corbyn carries the sort of cult of personality that Farage does. I don't think he has the communication skills. Reform fundamentally is a one man band behind Farage, and he just has the charisma to just about be able to hold together 4 or 5 MPs and his membership, right? I don't believe that Corbyn or Zoltana can do that. So I don't really see the party being much of a threat. I think the Greens, to the left of Labour, are far more of a threat. I think they've come out and made their position on foreign issues such as Gaza quite clear. I think that would be far more of a sort of a voter that was inclined to vote for the Corbynista party might look at the Greens as being a far more sensible option that still stands for the issues that they believe. What I would say is this is a very small minority of the country and is not really a voter base that would ever consider voting for the Conservatives anyway. So, in answer to that, I don't think it's a huge threat to the Conservatives or to reform. I think it might be a slight threat to the Greens, but I don't really see it being an issue because fundamentally, I think it will implode in one way or another in the way that reform is threatened to do, but it's just about carried on.
Well, I want to challenge you on that a little bit because I'm reading sort of the news right now, and the membership figures are a bit everywhere from 80,000 all the way to 250,000 members. Some even say 300,000 members, but let's assume it's about 200,000 members in 2 days. Jeremy Corbyn has managed to get more votes than Keir Starmer in his previous sort of elections. And I do think they're running on a pretty clear campaign of being pro-Palestine and for high taxes, which the sort of not, the sort of more left-wing ideologically base of the Labour Party, I think, would subscribe to. So the question there really is, will people who would have voted Labour but just don't like the leadership migrate over to Corbyn because he is back that old face who's managed to get votes and who's pretty clear on issues? I don't think it's more of an ideological thing here.
I think this is where people in the Labour Party have to be really careful because they have a tendency to forget what the Labour Party became under Corbyn, with serious issues of anti-Semitism, really serious issues. And all of a sudden, sort of 6 years later, people seem to have forgot that threatened at one point to sort of almost end the Labour Party as it was. It took Starmer probably 2.5 years to just about get over that tag of Labour being this sort of anti-Semitic party. So yes, they may have membership numbers. These left-wing sort of parties always tend to, I mean, when Corbyn got voted in 2015, 2016, and Labour were putting membership out for about £2 to £4 or something ridiculously low, and membership shot up. Back in the day, Labour used to have well over 1 million members when it was properly tied into the trade unions. So these sort of causes always galvanise a certain base, a very vocal, a very active base within the country. But I don't think membership numbers really are that telling of where the country is at. If the left of the Labour Party, the Labour Parliamentary Party, as it is now, are tempted with going over to that Corbynista side, I think they will really have another thing coming. And, particularly within those voter areas that are maybe slightly more sympathetic to Israel, are not quite so engaged with foreign policy. I think there's vast swathes of the country outside of the metropolitan urban areas where the issue of Gaza and Palestine, whilst very important, and let's not gloss over that, whilst very important, really is probably 5, 6, 7, or outside the top 10 of their list of priorities. So it may do very well for them in North London, in the Islington set area, or it may do very well in some other parts of urban Britain. But outside of that, their ability to gain any traction, I don't think it will. I think they will suffer from almost what UKIP did, where they will be very concentrated in their pockets and unable to pick up many, many seats or many votes outside of that, because it's just not an issue for your everyman within the wider country compared to cost of living or immigration or even things like Ukraine, I would say potentially sit higher, or relations with the and that's where reform probably are doing very well, because they're standing up for what the old Labour Party, the Labour Party of Wilson used to stand for, this sort of pride, pride in our country, but big states, high spending, sort of old-fashioned patriotic Labour. That is where reform now sits. They're the Labour Party of Harold Wilson, in a bizarre kind of juxtaposition, about turn that Farage has managed to do. Instead of being this radical right wing, he's become this sort of Wilson-esque figure. And no one seems to have questioned him, as he's crossed the massive economic divide between where he used to sit and where he sits now. I mean, he's the most pro-nationalisation individual in Parliament, from what I can tell. It's wild. So I don't think, going back to your Corbyn party point, that's where I sit on it. And I don't think many on the left of the Labour Parliamentary Party will actually make that transfer over, because I think it would take maybe one or two conversations to remind them of what it was like under Corbyn to maybe them in their place.
And I was going to say, I do agree with what both of you said there. And sort of almost to amalgamate your arguments, I think Corbyn will be very popular amongst young people who, as you said, Matt, probably don't have that experience of him as leader of the Labour Party. And there are sort of young people, quite politically and ideologically motivated people, who are concerned with this Gaza issue. However, these are young people who don't really represent, the average person in the United Kingdom. And I think that is where Corbyn will thrive, amongst young people who perhaps aren't as much confronting things like the cost of living crisis. Whereas I think, as you said there, I mean, I can remember when I was young and you'd always see anti-Semitism with Corbyn. There was huge distaste amongst the party surrounding his leadership. So I think perhaps longer-term Labour voters will struggle, but the young people who are quite ideologically and politically motivated, they will like Corbyn.
They possibly, probably will. But then there are other areas that we can go on Corbyn and say that this was the man that wanted to get rid of our nuclear deterrent and that wanted to lower defence spending. Now, in the world as it is now, does that seem like a sensible thing to do?
No, yeah.
Would any of them be behind that? Even our youngsters, who I believe, according to the Times, did a massive survey on views across Britain. I think it was about 2 months ago, and unanimously, everyone is in favour of higher defence spending. So, you can go at Corbyn on that lunatic of a policy, and he's for raising taxes. Well, who's he going to raise taxes on? Because I don't think we can squeeze out any more from, this idea of a wealth tax that's been floated by the likes of Neil Kinnock of late. Who's actually going to pay for that? Because they pay 26% of income tax in this country. And as we're seeing, Britain is the number one place for millionaires leaving the country. So there's not really much more juice to squeeze out of the top 1% or the top 5%. So when he talks about raising taxes, he's talking about raising it on working people, on taking pennies and pounds out of your pocket and out of my pocket to pay for more welfare. So we're going to essentially become, under his vision, a welfare state with an economy attached on the side, trundling along, which will eventually run out of petrol, and that petrol being willing taxpayers. So I think, it's not just the anti-Semitism issue with Corbyn, although I feel that is the strongest. There are so many basic, sort of nonsensical policies that really should just resign this man to the history books of politics as the failed Labour Party leader that he was.
What do you think is the big difference between Corbyn and Farage? I mean, you said that UKIP used to be this sort of centred organisation, but now Farage, from what I can see, has managed to sort of make reform into a national phenomenon. Why do you think that is? What do you think changed?
Farage is, I think, far, has far greater political instincts. He's a far better communicator. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. His ability to get cut through, no one in the country comes close. I really don't think they do. And he listens. Corbyn is very set in his views, which I believe to be completely the wrong views. And the country has failed to give him a majority twice. In 2019, he got completely slapped down. So I think everyone's in agreement on that. Farage has moved from where he was under UKIP to being relatively single issue, struggling to hold together a party that had some loony. He's moved himself from that very, very right wing view, got Brexit over the line, and whatever people say, that would never have happened without Nigel Farage. And now he's moved himself. He's made reform into a genuinely kind of, as I say, Wilson-esque party. Farage of 2007 was never pro-nationalisation to the extent that he is now. So he's moved his sort of economic base to this sort of a view where he's not against slightly higher tax, he's not against nationalisation. Whilst he talks that he wants lower taxes, I think in reality he wants to nationalise, he wants a big state. But he's also very, very conservative, or socially conservative on immigration and other social policies, and pride in country. And so he's sort of amalgamated the large state economic agenda with the sort of social conservatism in the same way that Donald Trump is. He is, look at the big beautiful bill. Donald Trump is a large stater. He wants more defense spending. He wants, more tax cuts, but also spending increases. He wants to borrow his way to do that. And actually, if you read Reform's manifesto going into 2024 general election, it was mental economically. I mean, it was tax cuts and spending rises like you wouldn't believe. The bond markets would have had absolutely none of it, and we would have bankrupted the country instantly. But very few people, other than myself, actually bothered to read the manifesto. But that's by the by, because it was economic fantasy land. But what Nigel Farage is doing is tapping into that Trump-esque, actually, people want the big state selling point. We're going to cut your taxes. We're going to increase spending. We're going to increase the size of the state fundamentally. But actually, we are going to hammer down on social issues, mainly immigration, but other social issues around sort of wokeness as well is quite a strong point. It's quite a strong point, certainly is for Trump. So I think Farage, unlike Corbyn, has managed to perform this sort of shape-shifting economic trick where he's moved and he's kept his social policies firmly in the conservative side, but he's moved himself over to the left on economics.
Just backing on that, do you think that the sort of far right nowadays is far right on social issues, but quite liberal on economic issues,
Yeah.
which is because
Absolutely.
I,
Absolutely. I
I would,
mean,
yeah,
politics is a circle, right? So, you go so far right, you end up on the left. And I think we're approaching that point. And I wouldn't say liberal on the economic issues. I would say bordering on socialist. I think economics to me is almost what I view myself as, which is a free trader, but not at the expense of national security. It is small state. It is prudence at home. So it's, cutting taxes, but doing that in a controlled way, not in the Liz Truss, mini budget disaster kind of way. It's about doing all of this in a prudent step by step way, getting towards a free trade position, growing the economy through innovation, government subsidies being very, very targeted as and where they need be. So not complete free trade, government gets out of the way, but just being very prudent and smart about where the state does exist. And that's why I believe, almost bringing this conversation full circle, the Conservatives will always be fine and will always have that USP because we are the only party that offers that genuinely small state economic vision to go with the social conservative stuff. So we are far more prudent, whereas Farage, whilst people think, oh, he's to the right of the Conservatives, he's really not. He's a left-wing party that just is really strong on immigration. And that's it. Whereas the Conservatives, when people actually think about it, and we will come out with more policies, particularly on the social front, but we are the only small state offering. And in the United States, I think reform almost comes out of what happens in the States, ripples across the pond and comes to us. They don't have a small state offering at the moment in the way that sort of Reagan was, for example, because Trump definitely isn't that. And at the moment, no one knows what the Democrats stand for. So I do think that actually that extreme right that you call it, they're not liberal economically. They are socialist economically and very, very strong, strong conservatives on the social issues, which is why I think so many on the right of the Conservative Party are kind of tempted by them. Those that maybe put the social issues slightly higher than they do the economic issues, And for me, I'm very clear. I'm a chartered accountant. My dad worked in banking. My brother works in finance. My mum worked in banking. Through my background, I probably put the arguments at the very top of any decision I make politically. I can't help but do that. It's almost in my nature. So therefore, for me, the reform option is nonsense. It always has to be the Conservatives, the genuinely small state offering. And that's why there will always be a future of the Conservative Party. But I do understand where Farage and where Reform have pivoted to. They're inhabiting the old space that Labour sort of used to inhabit pre-Blair, which I think a whole swathe of the Northern Wall, the Red Wall, were wanting and were crying out for, which under Blair and then under Corbyn, they feel they never had.
And as you earlier alluded to, Matt, I think the main sort of problem I've always had with Farage is this: not only his sort of economic fantasy land, as you said there, but also imperatively there is a gap between what Farage wants to do and what he can do. And I think he's got sort of, as he said, slightly dreamlike ideas of how he'd be in office, which are not at all politically aligned with what he says to be. And so the main question and our final question perhaps will be: Farage has been saying the Tories have been sort of wilting under this threat of reform. But how long do you think it will be before the Tories perhaps show their economic promise and how they offer this small state solution? And how long will it be before the Tories, in your opinion, are back in office?
I think see no reason why we can't win the next general election. I really don't. I know a lot of people are going to say he's mental, he's mad, but once we sort of really develop a good, solid, detailed policy platform, which we're nearly done with, but no one wants to hear it from us right now, but we're nearly done with that. And more scrutiny goes on what Farage starts to say, particularly on the economic front, because that's where I think we can pin him. That's where I think we can really, really do him on that economic front. And the more that the reform councils start to fail, and and the Doge departments, fame that there's this X amount of government waste the more that people start to realize that actually there isn't that much government waste. It's not waste in the sense of money's literally being, burned. It might be poor political decisions, but look at Elon Musk's Doge department. They failed to find even a fraction of what they expected to find. So once you see those Doge departments of reform start to fail, and they realize it's actually just about poor management, of which I don't believe reform are able to plug that gap, then I think people will start to find them out. I think, we just need the Conservatives to put forward this policy platform, be it in 6 months' time or 3 months' time or 9 months' time. And then as we get closer and closer to the next general, people will start asking more questions of reform's economic policy. They'll be reminded of what, and I hate to say it, under Liz Truss, what happens when you're reckless with tax cutting and increasing spending. They might see the impacts of the big beautiful bill across the pond and what that does to US debt prices. And I think there is absolutely no reason why the Conservatives can't win the next general election. And I'm absolutely here for it. And most importantly, we're going to win back Hammersmith and Fulham Council next May. I'm convinced of that. And it starts here.
And yes, if
Thank
you are
you very
listening
much.
from Hammersmith and Fulham, do watch out for Matt. I'm sure you're very active. Well, we know for a fact that you are one of the most active Tory campaigners, so I'm sure they'll be seeing more.
And if you want to give my Twitter a follow, it's M Sinclair HFC. So please do. There's lots to dive into on there, particularly on local issues, but also on national. So please do. And gentlemen, thank you very much for putting up with me for 40 minutes or so.
It's been
Thank you,
great
Matt.
to have you on. Yeah. Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
Cheers.